Welcome everyone to tonight's ghost story on the Village Ghost Story channel. Today, we will listen to the story Destroying the Temple of the Gods by author Don Giac. Now let's explore the creepy events of the story. Tear down that shrine. I don't want it on my land, shouted the wealthy landlord angrily. One of his workers, bowing respectfully, replied, "Sir, this is a sacred shrine that's been here for generations. The villagers have been coming here to pray and light incense for years. Tearing it down may not be a good idea." But the landlord didn't care. He yelled even louder. "Back then, this land was abandoned, and people could do whatever they wanted, but now it's mine. I decide whether it stays or goes. Knock it all down, and chop down those trees too." Hearing the order, the workers hesitated. None of them dared to lift a hand. The shrine had been built by the villagers hundreds of years ago, and there were rumors that it was very sacred. It was said that anyone who sincerely prayed here, especially if they were sick, would see their illness fade away in no time. This tale had made the whole village afraid to desecrate the shrine. Over 15 years ago, a couple who couldn't have children brought offerings to the shrine, praying for a child. That night, the wife had a dream about an old man in ragged clothes coming to their house, asking for food. Even though they were poor, they warmly invited him in and gave him their last bowl of porridge. The old man ate, laughed loudly, and left without saying a word. The next morning, the wife told her husband about the dream, and they laughed it off, thinking it was just a silly dream. But not long after, they saved a child who had been drifting down the river. No one knew where the child had come from, and everyone was too scared to take him in. In the end, the child was given to the couple. Miraculously, within a few years, their life improved and they became wealthy. The story spread through the village, and people believed that the child was a gift from the shrine's spirit. From that day on, the villagers brought offerings every year to the shrine, praying for prosperity. However, the landlord Dung wanted to claim the land for himself. Back in the present, the landlord saw that none of the workers dared to move, and he became furious. "You fools! Believing in this nonsense, my family has never worshipped anyone, and we still became successful. What has all your praying ever gotten you?" With that, the landlord stormed over to the shrine and kicked over the altar. Suddenly, a deafening thunderclap echoed, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The workers, terrified, dropped to their knees, begging for forgiveness. The landlord looked up, seeing dark clouds gathering in the sky. He scoffed, thinking it was just a storm approaching, and yelled again, "Do you want to go hungry today and not get paid this month? Get moving." But before they could react, a cold voice rang out from behind him. "Landlord, don't destroy the shrine, or misfortune will befall our village." The landlord whirled around and snapped, "Who are you to tell me what to do? Get out of my way." Looking around, seeing no one willing to act, the landlord took matters into his own hands. He grabbed a large stick and began smashing the shrine himself. As he did, he shouted, "Gods? Spirits? I'm the only god in this village. If anyone wants to pray, they need my permission first." As the landlord continued to destroy the shrine, bolts of lightning struck down nearby trees, splintering branches everywhere. The workers were terrified and fled in all directions, but the landlord remained oblivious. After finishing his rampage, he turned back to the young man who had warned him earlier and sneered, "Tell me, what misfortune is coming, huh? I've heard the villagers say you were brought to this village by the gods. Well, from now on, your parents will have to pay 5 times the usual tax. If they can't, they'll have to leave my village. Got it?" With that, the landlord turned and walked away, rain pouring heavily from the sky. The young man stood still, watching the landlord leave, shaking his head and muttering to himself, "If only the disaster would befall him alone. Now, the whole village will suffer because of his actions." His eyes filled with concern as he gazed at the ruined shrine, though he couldn't bring himself to speak. As he turned to leave, dark, smoky wisps began to rise from the large tree beside the shrine, vanishing into the eerie, foggy atmosphere. The next morning, the marketplace was buzzing with chatter about how the landlord had destroyed the sacred shrine. Many of the older villagers were trembling in fear, saying, "The curse is upon us now. That landlord is going to bring disaster to our village." Others, not understanding the situation, chimed in, "Oh, come on. If he wants to destroy the shrine, that's his problem. Why should we suffer for his actions?" An elderly villager added, "I heard it was only the landlord who destroyed the shrine. None of the workers dared to touch it." And so, the gossip continued throughout the village. At that moment, an old beggar appeared out of nowhere, sitting down in a corner and speaking in a voice that surprised everyone. A man approached him and asked, "What do you mean by that? If someone does something wrong, they should pay for it, not the whole village." The beggar calmly replied, "This isn't about divine punishment. The shrine was built to imprison powerful evil spirits. Have you ever noticed how unusually large the trees around the shrine are? That's where the spirits were being held. Now that the shrine has been destroyed, those spirits are free, and no one in this village will escape the coming disaster." Another villager scoffed, "I think this beggar is just making things up. We've lived here for generations, and no one has ever mentioned anything about ghosts or spirits. I was born and raised here, and I've never heard any of this. Besides, where did this old man even come from?" At this point, the villagers started splitting into two sides. One group believed the beggar, while the other followed the woman, who was skeptical. The beggar stood up, looked around at the crowd, and softly said, "Don't argue because of that landlord. Let fate take its course." With that, the old beggar quietly walked out of the village, leaving everyone unsure of what to believe. Just then, a few other women rushed over, panting heavily. "What's going on? Why were you shouting?" The woman who had seen the trees replied, her voice trembling, "It's over. Our village is doomed. The large trees around the shrine have all been struck by lightning, and there's blood oozing from them." Another woman, trying to stay calm, said, "Stop scaring us. Those trees have stood for hundreds of years. How could lightning knock them down like that?" The first woman quickly responded, "We just came back from there. Everything is in ruins, and there's red liquid flowing down the trees. It looks like blood." Many people, still unconvinced, decided to go see for themselves. Soon, the news spread, and over 100 villagers gathered around the shrine to witness the destruction. The sight left them horrified. The shrine was in ruins, and the trees around it had been uprooted and scattered everywhere. A strange, pale red liquid trickled down the trunks, resembling blood. The more superstitious villagers started whispering that it was the blood of the gods. However, some people believed the trees had been knocked down by a strong wind, though they pointed out that the previous night's storm wasn't strong enough to fell century-old trees. Stranger still, only the area around the shrine had been affected, while other large trees nearby were untouched. While the villagers were discussing what had happened, the furious landlord Dung suddenly appeared, shouting, "What are you all doing on my land? Trying to steal it from me?" A woman, unable to hold back any longer, shouted back, "You're the only one stealing land around here. You won't even leave a sacred place alone." Angered, the landlord slapped her across the face and roared, "Who do you think you're talking to? I'm the landlord of this village. Everything here belongs to me. If you want food on your table, you have to ask me first. This land isn't for you fools to mess around with. Now get out of here. If any of you come back, I'll break your legs." No one dared to argue further and reluctantly went home, seething with frustration. The landlord then ordered his servants to clean up the trees. Since the shrine had already been destroyed, the servants no longer feared the place and obediently followed his commands. Later that afternoon, strange things began happening in the village, causing the villagers to remember the beggar's warning. As night fell, while families were gathered for dinner, the eerie hoots of owls echoed through the air. While owls weren't uncommon, tonight their numbers were overwhelming. Even more terrifying, the branches of trees were crowded with owls, their glowing red eyes staring down like hunters stalking prey. Villagers tried using sticks and torches to scare them off, but the owls remained unmoved, their haunting cries filling the night air and adding to the unsettling atmosphere. At the home of the couple who had adopted the mysterious child, Mrs. Hua called out, "Than, what are you doing in your room all day? Come out and eat." From inside the room, Than replied, "You and Dad go ahead and eat. I'll join you later." Mrs. Hua looked outside, worried, and then sat down beside her husband, her voice filled with concern. "I don't know why, but but our son seems so strange today. He stayed in his room all day, not coming out once." Mr. Min chuckled and said, "Don't worry too much, dear. He's probably just busy with something. You forget, our son isn't exactly an ordinary person." At that moment, Leo, the housemaid, brought the food to the table and hesitantly asked, "Do you think that the destruction of the shrine could bring bad things?" Mrs. Hua, puzzled, responded, "Leo, if you're going to say something, say it clearly. Don't speak in half sentences. How are we supposed to understand?" Leo quickly explained, "This morning, when I went to the market, I heard people talking about how the shrine was destroyed. The large trees around it were all broken. It looked like the wind or storm last night caused it, but the strange thing is, red liquid was flowing down the trunks. It looked like blood, which was really creepy." Mr. Min nodded thoughtfully. "That is strange. There hasn't been any strong wind or storms recently. How could those huge trees have fallen like that? Maybe the shrine's destruction angered the spirits. Although I've never really believed in those things." The three of them sat down to eat together, as though they were a family. Since Mr. Min and Mrs. Hua had once experienced poverty, they understood Liu's struggles as a servant. In reality, they treated her like their own daughter, letting her eat with them and treating her as part of the family. Liu had been an orphan since she was 15, after her parents were killed in an accident. When her parents were alive, they had helped Mr. and Mrs. Min a great deal. After the couple became more prosperous, they took Liu in to give her a home and spare her from a life of loneliness. Although she was technically a servant, they treated her like their own child. She was given good food, clothes, and never had to do any hard labor, just simple tasks like cooking and cleaning alongside Mrs. Hua. As they were finishing the meal, Than, the couple's son, emerged from his room. Everyone was startled to see him dressed in the traditional garb of a spiritual master. Mr. Min, surprised, asked, "Son, why are you dressed like that?" Sitting down, Than started to eat and calmly explained, "Mom, Dad, the situation with the shrine is more complicated than you think. The ancient trees around the shrine were placed there to imprison powerful evil spirits. These trees, and the shrine itself, were part of a seal created by spiritual masters from long ago. But for some reason, the landlord destroyed the shrine, and now the spirits have been released. I need to quickly learn all the necessary spells to help the village before it's too late." Hearing their son speak, both Mr. Min and Mrs. Hua, along with Leo, were shocked. Since they had taken Than in, they knew he wasn't an ordinary child. When he was young, he would meditate in the yard from nightfall until nearly dawn before coming inside to sleep. At first, they didn't notice, but later Leo happened to see him and informed them. Over the years, Than had warned the villagers about upcoming disasters, and each time, his warnings came true. Because of this, everyone in the village trusted him, everyone except the landlord, Dung, who refused to believe in any of it. For some reason, the landlord had never suffered any misfortune, which made him believe he was untouchable, even by the gods. Now, hearing Than's concerns, Mr. and Mrs. Min became even more worried. It was the first time they had seen their son so tense, losing sleep over the situation. Later that night, disaster finally struck the village. Around midnight, the villagers were awakened by a terrifying scream. The scream rang out once and then abruptly stopped. Many people went outside to investigate, but couldn't hear anything more and didn't know where to look. The village was vast, spanning 10 square miles, surrounded by trees and marshland. It was nearly impossible to find direction in the dark. The following morning, as villagers went out to work in the fields, they discovered 2 bodies floating in a pond near a narrow path leading into the marsh. When they flipped the bodies over, they were horrified. Both faces were deathly pale, and dark blood was dried at the corners of their mouths. The most disturbing part was that no one could find a clear cause of death. One person suggested, "Maybe they were struck by a cold wind. I don't see any wounds on their bodies." Another woman shook her head in disagreement. "A cold wind wouldn't turn their faces this pale or their blood this black. I think they were bitten by some venomous snake. That's why their blood turned dark." People threw out different theories, but none of them made sense. Everyone knew that the 2 had died around midnight, the same time as the scream. Only 3 hours had passed since their deaths, not enough time for the bodies to show such strange signs. A local herbalist came over to inspect the bodies, frowning in confusion. "This is bizarre. The signs indicate they were poisoned, but I can't detect any toxins. And they haven't been dead long, so why do their bodies already have a foul odor?" The herbalist was still pondering when the landlord, Dung, arrived and barked, "What are all of you doing gathered here like this?" "Sir," one of the villagers answered nervously, "we don't know what happened, but 2 people died last night, and we're trying to figure out why." The wealthy landlord stepped closer to the body, and as soon as he saw it, he was startled. The corpse was changing before his eyes, its skin cracking open, black blood oozing out, and a horrible stench filling the air. Furious, he shouted, "Who did this? If no one finds the culprit, you'll all pay 3 silver coins in tax. You have until this afternoon to give me answers." With that, he turned his back and walked away, leaving the villagers confused and anxious. An elderly man watched the landlord leave and muttered, "Is that man even human anymore? He claims to protect the village, but now he's imposing unfair penalties on us. I have a feeling he's involved in this somehow." Mrs. Liu, standing nearby, chimed in, "What do you mean by that? Do you have proof? If you do, let's go and tear his house down." She laughed bitterly and replied, "If I had proof, I wouldn't just be guessing, but think about it. Who else in this village is more ruthless than him? And if it wasn't him, why would he impose such random fines? Also, since when does he leave his house at this hour?" As Mrs. Liu spoke, many villagers began to consider her words. One man added, "She's right. The landlord rarely leaves his house except around noon, and even then, it's only when the crops are ready. This time, if he's really involved, we'll need to find proof and expose him. That's why he's so confident. We think we can't do anything." Another villager spoke up. "Enough guessing. Let's focus on bringing the bodies back to their families, and we'll figure this out later." The group stopped their gossip and began the task of moving the bodies. By late morning, Mr. Mont, a villager, stopped by to offer his condolences to the victims' families. As soon as he arrived, a group of women pulled him aside, asking urgently, "Mr. Mont, has your son said anything about the shrine? These deaths are strange. They don't seem like normal killings." Sighing, Mr. Mont replied, "I know about it, but talking about it won't solve anything right now. I want to give my son time to work on it quietly before we make things public." One woman clicked her tongue. "Does your son know about spirits or something? Last night, I didn't hear anything. How could this be related to the shrine?" Hearing this, the women crowded around him, pressing for answers. "Tell us what you know about the shrine. 2 people are already dead, and you're still holding back?" Mr. Mont sat down, took a sip of tea, and calmly explained, "When Nia was still alive, he told me about the history of the shrine, but I never shared it because I didn't think anyone would believe me." One woman urged him on, "Well, you'd better tell us now. 2 people have already died. How many more do we have to lose before you speak up?" Mr. Mao, a neighbor, added, "She's right. If you know something, now's the time to share. The landlord is expecting answers by this afternoon, and if we don't have them, we'll all be fined." With a deep sigh, Mr. Mont began. Nia said the shrine was built during his father's time. Back then, this area was all dense forest, and the village was tiny, with only a handful of homes. Spirits and demons roamed freely. One night, Nia's father was returning home late from work. He saw a group of people walking ahead of him and assumed they were fellow villagers. He tried to catch up to walk with them, but when he got closer, he realized they weren't walking. They were gliding over the ground. He paused for a moment before continuing. He rushed home and told everyone what he saw. From that night on, people occasionally reported seeing similar things. Then, about 2 years later, someone was found dead, and their body was horribly disfigured. No one understood what was happening, and suddenly, an old beggar appeared in the village. He said that the village was cursed by evil spirits, and that if they weren't stopped, no one would survive. The beggar asked for a bottle of wine and a boiled chicken to help exorcise the spirits. The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word as Mr. Mont continued. The beggar's request wasn't too difficult, so the villagers agreed. After he'd eaten, the beggar went to the shrine and performed a ritual. That night, The village was filled with terrifying scenes. By morning, the beggar was sitting by the shrine, and he had built it himself, planting the large trees that surrounded it. He warned the villagers never to destroy the shrine or cut down the trees, or disaster would strike. From that day on, the story of the shrine spread, and everyone expected the beggar's word, never daring to disobey. One of the women spoke up. Did anyone notice the small shrine inside the larger one? That's the original shrine the beggar built. At this, another woman suddenly exclaimed, "Oh no, yesterday in the market, there was an old beggar talking about ghosts in the shrine. Could he be the same beggar from back then?" Mr. Mao quickly interjected, "Come on, don't scare us like that. That story is over 200 years old. No one lives that long." Everyone fell silent, feeling uneasy about the situation. Mrs. Liu broke the silence. "It doesn't matter anymore. Tomorrow, we'll head to the market and find that beggar. This is no longer something that humans can handle." She then pointed toward the coffin resting in the house. Blood was dripping from the coffin onto the floor, sending a chill through everyone. One man cried out, "Dear God, what's happening? Is the dead trying to send us a message?" Another person added, "This isn't something simple. I bet something dark has escaped from that shrine." Mr. Han, still confused, asked, "Mr. Hai, you need to explain more. Things are getting too messy, and if we don't find a solution, this is going to get even worse." Mr. Hai sighed deeply, sitting at the table, his eyes distant as if recalling old memories. Another woman urged him, "Mr. Hai, stop brooding like that. Things are bad enough already. Just tell us what you know." Slowly, Mr. Hai began to speak. "That shrine, it's not simple. Many years ago, 4 powerful sorcerers trapped 3 extremely dangerous demons there. One of them sacrificed their life to seal the demons. Underneath the shrine lies the soul of that sorcerer. But I don't understand how the shrine was destroyed so easily now." He continued, "About 50 years ago, a few people tried to destroy the shrine, but they all fell terribly ill afterward. They couldn't recover until their families went to the shrine to offer apologies. But now, somehow, that old landlord, Mr. Duong, has managed to tear the shrine down without any consequence." Someone spoke up, "Could it be that Mr. Ha Duong has some dark magic protecting him? Remember when my son warned us about the shrine? Mr. Duong didn't believe it, and we all suffered while he stayed untouched." Hearing this, the crowd grew more anxious. Mr. Man chimed in, "I'm not sure about everything, but I know what I heard from Nia. Both stories mention those demons in the shrine." The story was becoming more mysterious, and no one knew what to believe. Meanwhile, somewhere else, Mr. Duong and his servants were walking down a path when a stranger suddenly bumped into him and then vanished. His servants rushed to help him up. One of them exclaimed, "Where did that guy go? He just bumped into the master and disappeared like a ghost." Mr. Duong, irritated, snapped, "What are you talking about? Find him." The servant, nervous, stammered, "I don't know, master. He ran off so fast, and there's no place for him to hide here. It's like he vanished into thin air." Mr. Duong slapped the servant. "You fool! Are you trying to scare me? There are no ghosts in broad daylight." Still shaken, the servant replied, "I'm not trying to scare you, but after he bumped into you, I looked around and couldn't see him anywhere." Mr. Duong stood up, scanning the surroundings. The road was wide open, with no trees or bushes for anyone to hide behind. The time between the bump and when he stood up was too short for anyone to escape. Though he sensed something was wrong, Mr. Duong still refused to believe in ghosts. Muttering under his breath, he continued walking. Just as the 3 of them turned away, a shadowy figure emerged from behind, heading toward the village. Back at Tan's house, Mr. Man said, "You and Leo go ahead and cook dinner. I'll eat at the wake." Mrs. Hua rushed out and protested, "With everything happening, you're going to leave us alone? Stay home tonight. You can pay your respects tomorrow." Mr. Man chuckled, teasing, "Are you afraid of ghosts now? You've never even seen one." Mrs. Hua was about to scold him when Than walked out of his room, serious. "Dad, I don't think you should go. I feel something big is about to happen tonight, though I'm not sure when." Hearing this, Mr. Man became concerned. "Then I need to warn everyone to go home and stay safe." Than sighed. "Even if you warn them, I don't think it will help. But go ahead and tell them anyway. Whether they believe it or not is up to them." With that, Than returned to his room. Mrs. Hua exchanged worried glances with Leo. They felt helpless because, for as long as they could remember, only Thang had been able to foresee the strange happenings in the village. No one else could handle these eerie events. Mr. Mon quickly headed to the wake to warn everyone. Night had fallen, and Mrs. Hua and Leo anxiously waited for his return. When Mr. Man finally came back, Mrs. Hua rushed to meet him. "Did anyone listen to you? Why do you look so tired, and is that the smell of alcohol?" Sighing, Mr. Man sat down. "Come inside, and I'll explain. Things have gotten scarier." Inside, Leo poured him a cup of water. Mr. Man looked at her kindly and said, "Leo, I've always thought of you as my daughter, not just someone who works for us. If anything happens, please don't leave Than alone." Leo was startled by his words, but nodded, touched by the affection. "Yes, I know how much you and Mrs. Hoa care for me. Ever since you took me in after my parents died, I've felt like I owe you so much. No matter what happens, I won't leave." Mrs. Hoa then turned to Mr. Man and said, "I have an idea. What if we officially adopt Leo as our daughter? And maybe, when the time is right, we can arrange for her and Than to marry." Leo blushed, but deep down, she was happy. She had always been close to Than, and the thought of being part of the family made her heart warm. But before she could respond, Thang stepped into the room, and everyone turned their attention back to the pressing matters at hand. Both Leo and Mrs. Hua were confused, not understanding why Mr. Mine suddenly brought up such things. Leo, feeling a bit shy, replied, "I know how much you and Mrs. Hua care for me. Ever since you took me in after my parents passed away, I've felt deeply indebted to you. I won't leave, no matter what happens. But why are you telling me this now?" Mrs. Hua then added, "You know, Mun, I've been thinking, what if we officially adopt Leo as our daughter? And in a few years, we could marry her off to Than. Having a daughter-in-law like her is a rare find." Leo blushed, feeling a mix of joy and nervousness. Ever since she was little, she had been very close to Than. When Mr. and Mrs. Mont rescued Than and took him in, Leo was the one who spent the most time with him. Even when her parents were alive, they used to joke, if they're meant to be, let them marry each other so Leo won't have to go far away. Now, hearing Mrs. Hua suggest this, Leo couldn't help but feel happy, but she was also worried. She was 2 years older than Than, and over the years, many young women in the village had started to notice him. Mr. Mont and Mrs. Hua even had to chase some of them away. Mr. Mont nodded and said, "Leo, don't worry. We've always considered you as part of the family, like our own daughter." Leo knelt down and said, "I'm just a simple girl without family. I could never have dreamed of anything more. Now that you're offering to adopt me, I can't refuse. But as for marrying Than, I believe in letting fate decide. It's not something that can be forced." Mr. Mont laughed, helping her stand up. "No more calling us Mr. and Mrs. From now on, you can call us Mom and Dad. And don't worry about Than. If he dares to disobey, I'll take care of him." Mrs. Hua, a bit startled, quickly jumped in. "Hey, don't pressure the boy. If you even think about hitting my son, you'll have to answer to me. And what's with all this talk today? Hurry up and tell me what happened at the wake." Mr. Mont sighed and replied, "There's really not much to tell. I gave them the warning and then came back home." Still suspicious, Mrs. Hua asked, "And why did you take so long? Where were you?" Leo, sensing Mrs. Hua's jealousy, quickly intervened. "Please don't be upset. If you get too jealous, Mr. Mont will be sleeping outside tonight." Mr. Ming, trying to explain, said, "I swear, there's no reason to be jealous. After I left the wake, I ran into an old beggar sitting in the middle of the road. I gave him a few coins and was about to leave, but he stopped me. The strange thing is, he started talking about our 2 children." Intrigued by where the story was going, both Mrs. Hua and Leo pulled up chairs to listen to Mr. Mont's tale. Just then, Than stretched as he came out of his room, looking sleepy. Leo stood up and offered her seat to Thang, asking, "Would you like me to make you something to drink?" Hearing that, Mrs. Hoa affectionately scolded, "Hey, why do you call him uncle? From now on, you have to call him brother, understand? Come on, go make him a drink." Leo smiled and ran to work, while Than asked in confusion, "Why did you always call me uncle and I called you sister, but now you suddenly changed the way we address each other like this?" Mr. Mont brushed aside the small talk and went straight to the point, saying, "Let me ask you something, son. Do you have feelings for Leo?" romantic feelings. Thang was a bit embarrassed and surprised by his father's blunt question, but after being pressed, he admitted, "Yes, Dad, Leo and I have grown up together for over 15 years. I've thought about asking for your permission to marry her, but I figured it would be a few more years before I did." Mr. Mont hurried him. "A few years? No way. You need to marry her sooner rather than later. Leo's youth won't last forever, and what if she falls for someone else in the meantime? You're not a kid anymore. It's time to get serious." He continued, "Back in my day, I was your age when I met your mother. As soon as I met her, I married her." Mrs. Hua, playfully hitting his arm, chimed in, "You're proud of yourself, aren't you? I was only 15, and you couldn't wait." Their conversation wasn't lost on Leo, who overheard everything from the kitchen. She couldn't help but smile to herself, relieved that Than had feelings for her too. For a long time, she had worried that he might not accept her. Now, with his confession, she no longer had anything to fear. Leo stepped out of the kitchen and gently handed Than a cup of tea. "Here, drink this to warm up. I've already prepared dinner, so just let me know when you're hungry." Thane blinked in surprise. Not long ago, she had been calling him Ko, but now, with a sweet tone, she was calling him An. Mr. and Mrs. Ming exchanged knowing smiles, glad that things were finally starting to fall into place. Mr. Ming then continued, "Here's what I'm thinking. You two can tell me what you think. Next month, we'll hold a small feast, invite the neighbors, and announce that you two are getting married." Both Thang and Leo were startled by this sudden plan. Mrs. Hua, equally surprised, asked, "Are you still in such a rush, Man? Can't we let them take their time and build their relationship slowly? We don't need to rush." But Mr. Mont was firm in his decision. "Listen, we're not going to live forever, and I don't want to wait too long. What if we're gone before they get around to it? They've liked each other since they were little, and no one's forcing them into this. I see other people's grandkids, and I get envious. I want to hold my own grandchild before I'm gone. Besides, with all the strange things happening in the village right now, I'm worried." His voice grew more serious as he said this, and Than spoke up. "Dad, I've been meaning to talk to you about what's happening in the village. If I can't defeat those evil spirits and something happens to me, then Leo will become a widow. I don't want that for her." Leo quickly interrupted, "Don't worry about me. If something happens while you're trying to help people, I'll stay behind and take care of your parents. I'll keep the family shrine going and honor you for the rest of my life. You just focus on what you need to do. I'll wait as long as it takes." Mr. and Mrs. Mun were moved by Leo's words. Finally, Mrs. Hua said, "All right, we'll leave it up to you. But now, I want to know what's going on in the village. What did that beggar say to you that kept you out so late, Mun?" Mr. Mun sighed, realizing he couldn't avoid telling the story any longer. He began, "It's a bit complicated, so try to keep up. On my way home, I ran into this old beggar. After I gave him some money, he asked me to sit with him. He started talking about a lot of things, but what really caught my attention was when he mentioned our 2 children. The beggar sat down and asked, 'You're not afraid to sit and talk with me?' Most people would keep their distance." Mr. Mont smiled and replied, "Why should I look down on anyone? No one is perfect. My wife and I used to beg for food ourselves. Beggars are people too, with their own sorrows and burdens. If you don't mind, why don't you come home with me? You can help with a few light chores, and we'll feed you." The beggar laughed heartily and nodded in approval. "Good, good. I knew you were a man of kindness. How about sharing a drink with me?" Although a bit surprised, Mr. Mont, being an honest man, didn't hesitate to agree. He spotted a mango tree nearby and went to pick a few mangoes and some plums to pair with the drink. At this point, Mrs. Hua interrupted, "What's so strange about that? Sounds like you were just enjoying a drink and lost track of time. Are you making this up?" Than, curious, asked, "Dad, the way you're talking makes it sound like this beggar knows us. Did he say anything more?" Mr. Mont continued, "Yes, he talked a lot, and it was all related to you, Thang. After drinking for a bit, the old man said, 'This village is in trouble, but luckily I brought the boy here early. Now, go home and encourage your son to master everything he needs to help the people.' I asked him how he knew so much about our village and what my son could possibly learn when no one had taught him. The old man just laughed and said, "Don't worry, just tell him, and he'll understand. I can't do much myself, but I can hold the evil spirits back for as long as possible, so your son can finish learning the spells to destroy them." At this point, Mr. Mont was feeling suspicious, so he tried to dig deeper into the beggar's past. "How do you know so much about my village? You've only been here for a few days," he had asked. The old man finished his drink and replied with a laugh, "I don't have a home, so you wouldn't have seen me before. But that's not important. I came to warn you and help protect your family, as well as guide your son." Even though Mr. Munn pressed for more answers, the beggar didn't reveal anything further about himself. Instead, he changed the subject, and once the wine was gone, stood up and left the village. Mr. Mint returned home and said to Than, "He spoke in riddles, and I didn't understand much of it. You seem to know more. What did he mean?" Than, looking mysterious, replied, "Don't worry, Dad. I know what I need to do. You all should relax. I'll head to my room to continue working." Leo, concerned, called after him, "Aren't you going to eat? You haven't eaten all day." Than just smiled and walked away. Leo was about to call him again, but Mrs. Hua stopped her, saying, "Let him be. He'll eat when he's hungry. If you're tired, go to sleep. Your father and I will stay up a bit longer." Leo nodded and went to rest. Mr. Ming, staring out into the night, sighed, "I'm really worried. I don't know if our son can save this village. Things are looking grim." Mrs. Hua, trying to console him, said, "We were lucky to have him in our lives. It's fate. If he can help the village survive this disaster, and if something happens to him, then it's his destiny. I'm going to bed now, and you should rest too. You've been stressing yourself out lately." Mr. Mun, not ready to let go of his worries, grabbed her hand and said, "Maybe we should let them have a child together now. If anything happens to Than, at least we'll have a grandchild to love. Otherwise, we'll be all alone." Mrs. Hua gently slapped his arm, replying, "Let them decide that for themselves. We shouldn't interfere." She walked back inside, leaving Mr. Mont alone with his thoughts. Realizing he was being a bit hasty, he set those thoughts aside for now and tried to make sense of the beggar's cryptic words. Meanwhile, over at Fu Ho Dung's house, the rich landlord was sitting in his room, drinking and laughing with two servant girls. He ordered, "Bring me more wine, and make sure everything is watched over." The household servant stood outside, enviously eyeing the feast spread out on the table. Despite his wealth, Fu Ho Dung treated his workers terribly. If anyone didn't complete their tasks, they'd be punished, sometimes starved or beaten. Even though he often didn't finish his food, any servant caught eating the leftovers would face brutal consequences. Dung would rather throw the food away than let his staff eat it. His voice grew more serious as he said this, and Than spoke up. "Dad, I've been meaning to talk to you about what's happening in the village. If I can't defeat those evil spirits and something happens to me, then Leo will become a widow. I don't want that for her." Leo quickly interrupted, "Don't worry about me. If something happens while you're trying to help people, I'll stay behind and take care of your parents. I'll keep the family shrine going and honor you for the rest of my life. You just focus on what you need to do. I'll wait as long as it takes." Mr. and Mrs. Munn were moved by Leo's words. Finally, Mrs. Hua said, "All right, we'll leave it up to you. But now, I want to know what's going on in the village. What did that beggar say to you that kept you out so late, Mun?" Mr. Munn sighed, realizing he couldn't avoid telling the story any longer. He began, "It's a bit complicated, so try to keep up. On my way home, I ran into this old beggar. After I gave him some money, he asked me to sit with him. He started talking about a lot of things, but what really caught my attention was when he mentioned our two children. The beggar sat down and asked, 'You're not afraid to sit and talk with me?' Most people would keep their distance." Mr. Mont smiled and replied, "Why should I look down on anyone? No one is perfect. My wife and I used to beg for food ourselves. Beggars are people too, with their own sorrows and burdens. If you don't mind, why don't you come home with me? You can help with a few light chores, and we'll feed you." The beggar laughed heartily and nodded in approval. "Good, good. I knew you were a man of kindness. How about sharing a drink with me?" Although a bit surprised, Mr. Mon, being an honest man, didn't hesitate to agree. He spotted a mango tree nearby and went to pick a few mangoes and some plums to pair with the drink. At this point, Mrs. Hua interrupted. "What's so strange about that? Sounds like you were just enjoying a drink and lost track of time. Are you making this up?" Than, curious, asked, "Dad, the way you're talking makes it sound like this beggar knows us. Did he say anything more?" Mr. Mont continued, "Yes, he talked a lot, and it was all related to you, Thang." After drinking for a bit, the old man said, "This village is in trouble, but luckily I brought the boy here early. Now, go home and encourage your son to master everything he needs to help the people." I asked him how he knew so much about our village and what my son could possibly learn when no one had taught him. The old man just laughed and said, "Don't worry, just tell him and he'll understand. I can't do much myself, but I can hold the evil spirits back for as long as possible, so your son can finish learning the spells to destroy them." At this point, Mr. Mont was feeling suspicious, so he tried to dig deeper into the beggar's past. "How do you know so much about my village? You've only been here for a few days," he had asked. Dung, now overconfident, grinned arrogantly. "Of course, you help me, and I'll make sure you're surrounded by food, wine, and women for life. So will you serve me?" The beggar slammed his hand on the table, causing Dung to choke in fear. In a cold voice, the beggar said, "You wicked fool. Who do you think you are, giving orders to me? With your greed, I could kill you right now and take everything you own." Fuho's face drained of color as he realized he had gravely underestimated the old man. Falling to his knees, he begged, "Please forgive me. I spoke out of turn. I didn't know who I was dealing with. Spare me, I beg you." The beggar's expression softened into a faint smile, and he finally relented. "Fine, I'll let you live, but from now on, you follow my orders. Once your task is complete, I'll leave. First thing, you're not to harm the villagers anymore. Stay in your house and focus on your practice. I'll stay here and help, but not for long." For the first time in his life, Fu Hou-dung had someone else giving him orders, and it made him uncomfortable. Still, he was smart enough to know when to bend. After thinking it over, he realized the beggar's advice was wise. "I'll lay low for now," he thought. "Once I've mastered this forbidden magic, my power will surpass anything, and I'll rule over more than just this village. A little humiliation now is worth the reward." Changing his demeanor, Dung forced a smile and said, "Of course, I'll follow your instructions. From now on, I won't bother anyone. I'll focus only on my studies. Please stay as long as you like. I'll make sure you're well taken care of." He pulled out a heavy bag and placed it in front of the beggar. "Here's a small gift of money. You can spend it however you wish. May I now offer you some more wine?" The beggar glanced at the bag, unimpressed. "You have piles of gold and silver lying around, and this is what you offer me? Fine. If that's all, I'll be on my way, and whatever happens to you next is on you." With that, the beggar made as if to leave. The beggar stood up, ready to leave, but Fu Hou-dung quickly rushed over to beg him to stay. Knowing he needed the beggar's help to complete the forbidden ritual, he pulled out 5 gold ingots and handed them to the beggar, saying, "Here, take this. Spend it as you like. Tomorrow I'll give you even more." The beggar finally sat back down at the table, agreeing to continue drinking. By midnight, the beggar had passed out on the table, while Fu Hou-dung sat back with a smug smile, thinking to himself, "I've invested a little, but soon I'll reap great rewards. A few gold pieces in exchange for such success is well worth it." He called for his servants to clean up and prepare a room for the beggar to sleep in. But before heading to his own room, Fu Hou glanced over and noticed the 2 servants, whom he thought had died earlier, were now miraculously alive again. He smirked, satisfied that the beggar really was a powerful mystic who could bring the dead back to life. Turning to the revived servants, Fu Hou ordered, "From now on, you will serve this guest with the utmost care. Displease him, and you know what your fate will be." The 2 servants exchanged confused glances. One asked the other, "Do you have any idea where this beggar came from? Why would Fu Hou give a beggar so much gold?" The other servant replied, "We barely escaped death tonight, and now this old man shows up. I don't think we'll have another peaceful day as long as he's around. Look at all that gold on the table, but taking any would surely get us killed." Reluctant, they helped the beggar to his room. Around midnight, Fuho Dung, unable to rest, decided to take a walk. He wandered through the house and eventually reached the room far end of the hallway. Just as he was about to open the door, a dark figure appeared before him. Staggering back in shock, Fuho demanded, "Who are you? How dare you enter my home?" The dark figure remained silent, standing still. Growing more irritated, Fuho stepped forward angrily. "You must have a death wish. Fine, I'll end it for you." As he lunged forward to strike, his entire body was lifted into the air. The figure's face illuminated with two fiery red eyes, and a terrifying screech filled the air, waking everyone in the house, causing them to cover their ears in pain from the deafening sound. Sensing something was terribly wrong, the beggar rushed out to investigate. But by the time he arrived, the dark figure had transformed into a cloud of smoke and entered Fuho's body. The beggar exclaimed in horror, "It's too late! The three evil spirits have merged." He quickly pulled out a talisman and hurled it toward the possessed Fuho, but it was already too late. The evil spirits had fully inhabited Fuho's human form, rendering the talisman useless. Suddenly, a voice came from Fuho Dung, but it wasn't his own. It was the voice of the evil spirits. "I've waited a long time for this moment. Now let's see how you'll defeat us." The beggar, realizing he had failed to prevent the spirits from merging, calmly responded, "So, you've merged. But don't celebrate too soon. Your power isn't fully restored yet. I won't let you achieve your plans. 3 days from now, we will meet at the place where, long ago, you used your tricks to trap us. This time, I'll make sure you pay for all your wrongs. You'll learn what it means to be imprisoned." With that, the possessed Fuho Dung disappeared. The servants, now gathered and trembling with fear, turned to the beggar and asked, "What was that horrible scream we heard?" The beggar, determined to keep the truth of Fuho's possession a secret, replied, "Your master is focused on his training. No one is to disturb him in that room. And what happened tonight, none of you are to speak of it to anyone, or else you'll face terrible consequences." With that warning, the beggar returned to his quarters. The remaining servants, confused and frightened, whispered amongst themselves, "So it's true? Fuho really is practicing dark magic? What are we going to do? If he was cruel before, what's going to happen now?" Another servant chimed in, "You think that's bad? Earlier tonight, the beggar killed several men and then they came back to life. How is that even possible?" A skeptical servant asked, "Are you serious? There's no way someone could kill people and bring them back to life. The beggar barely touched anyone. He just passed out at the table." One of the women serving drinks earlier added, "Believe me, I saw it with my own eyes. Those men were dead, and then they came back. Ask anyone who was in the room." The servants, now convinced, were shaken by the strange events. No one could fathom the idea of someone dying and being resurrected. Reluctantly, they agreed to keep quiet, fearing for their own lives. Once everyone had left, the beggar silently exited the house and disappeared into the night without anyone noticing. His original goal had been to stop Fuho Dung from causing harm to Thang, and he left without touching any of the gold. The following morning, as Mr. Munt sat sipping tea in his yard, Thang joined him for a conversation. Suddenly, Mr. Munt's gaze shifted toward the road, causing Thang to ask curiously, "What are you looking at, Father?" Mr. Munt pointed outside and said, "Look, isn't that the beggar from the other day?" Thang squinted, then replied, "I've never seen him before, so I can't tell. But there is a man walking toward our house." They both sat down to wait, but strangely, the man suddenly disappeared. Mr. Mont felt a sense of unease and stood up to check the village road, but there was no one in sight. Just as he was about to speak, he was startled to find the beggar from yesterday standing right beside him, only 2 meters away. Mr. Mont, shocked, asked, "How did you get here? I just saw you far down the road." The beggar merely smiled and walked into the house. He stopped to gaze at Tan for a moment before nodding and saying, "I never thought my old friend would be so handsome in this lifetime." Both father and son were surprised, but when they tried to ask more questions, the beggar skillfully changed the subject. He began to speak seriously. "Listen, young man, the 3 evil spirits have now merged and are hiding within the body of Fuho Dung. The only way to defeat them is to lure them out of their human host, but right now they are hiding very well, and even I can't trace their location." Than, puzzled, asked, how could the three evil spirits merge into one? If they did, their power must have increased threefold. How can the people of our village possibly survive that? The beggar smiled and said, you're speaking like that because you haven't faced them yet. Fortunately, before we sealed them away many years ago, we managed to weaken part of their strength. Over the centuries, their spiritual energy has also been depleted. So now, even though they've escaped, they only have a fraction of their former power left. At this point, the villagers are counting on you. Then the beggar handed Than a book, saying, this is a book that will help you learn more spells. Tonight, I'll keep them at bay, but tomorrow, you will have to act. Mr. Man, alarmed, exclaimed, my son hasn't learned anything yet. How can he possibly fight those evil spirits? That's like sending him to his death. The beggar, calm and composed, replied, there's no time left for long training. If things were that simple, I wouldn't be asking your son to step in. Than sighed, looking at his father, and said, maybe this is a challenge meant for me. Don't worry, I'll be very careful. With that, Than bowed to everyone and went back inside to continue his training. Once it was just the two of them, the beggar finally explained everything to Mr. Man. Your son is not an ordinary person. Tomorrow, you'll see what he's capable of. Let me tell you a story. Years ago, when you and your wife went to the temple to pray for a child, your wife wasn't able to conceive. But the truth is, the soul of a great sorcerer, the one who sealed away the evil spirits, had chosen to be reborn as your son. He knew that only by being reborn as a human could he finally destroy those evil spirits once and for all. Mr. Man was stunned. You mean to say my son is the sorcerer who sacrificed his life to seal away those demons, and he reincarnated to finish them off, and you brought him to us to raise? The beggar laughed heartily, and in a flash he transformed into an elderly man with a long white beard and hair, wearing unusual robes unlike anything Mr. Man had seen before. The beggar revealed his true identity. I am Than, one of the 4 sorcerers who originally imprisoned the evil spirits. I've come now to help your son complete his training so he can defeat them. There's no time to explain further, but we must stop them before they harm the villagers. Mr. Man, still reeling from the revelation, rushed forward and asked, if you're so powerful, why don't you just defeat the demons yourself? Why let my son do it when his chances are so slim? The sorcerer smiled, then vanished into thin air, leaving only his voice lingering in the air. If it were that simple, I wouldn't need to be here. This is a trial for your son to reach his full potential and to live a peaceful human life. Unable to ask more, Mr. Wallet Mine understood that the sorcerer had his reasons for letting Than face the challenge. Though his heart was filled with worry for his son, he had no choice but to trust the sorcerer's judgment. He returned inside, trying to act normal so as not to worry his wife and Leo. Time passed quickly, and soon the second day had arrived, the day Than would face the evil spirits. Mr. Man's anxiety grew, but he kept it hidden from his wife and Leo. Today could be the day his family was torn apart forever. That evening, after dinner, Mrs. Hua and Leo were busy cleaning up downstairs, while Than and Mr. Man stood outside in the yard, gazing into the dark, ominous night. They didn't exchange a word, but their hearts were heavy with worry. Than finally sighed, turned to his father, and said, Dad, take care of Mom for me. If I don't return tonight, you and Mom must tell everyone to leave the village and head south by tomorrow. If they stay, no one will survive. I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye to Mom and Leo in person. Hearing this, Mr. Mont felt a lump in his throat, but managed to say only one short sentence. Take care of yourself, son. Then stepped into the darkness, and his father stood watching his son's silhouette fade until it completely disappeared. Only then did Mr. Ming turn back into the house, quietly closing the door behind him. He sat down at the long wooden table in the middle of the house, and tears streamed down his face. When Mrs. Hua and Leo finished their chores and came outside, they saw Mr. Mont sitting there, his expression filled with sorrow. Without saying a word, both women instantly knew what had happened. They broke down in tears, unsure whether Thang would return from this dangerous journey. Deep inside, they both understood that had Thang told them beforehand, they would have done everything to stop him. But now, all they could do was sit in silence, praying for his safe return. Outside, fierce winds began to howl, thunder rumbled, and faint, eerie cries echoed from every direction. The family huddled inside, terrified of the chaos outside. No one in the house could sleep. Each time they heard a scream, they strained their ears, hoping it wasn't Than's voice. Time dragged on, and the night became even more terrifying as it wore on. Suddenly, a loud explosion shook the ground, jolting everyone awake. Mr. Munt couldn't bear it any longer. He rushed to the door, flung it open, and ran outside. He stared in astonishment at the distant temple, where a brilliant golden light shot down from the heavens, illuminating the ground. And then, just as suddenly, everything fell eerily silent. For a long while, there was no further movement, but soon the villagers began to gather, drawn to the disturbance. Mr. Munt sat down on the ground, staring into the distance, hoping that Thang would come back. Thang had told him that if he didn't return by morning, it meant he had lost the battle. As the first light of dawn appeared, Mr. Munt still saw no sign of his son. Overcome with grief, he collapsed onto the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Leo, who had followed him, was determined to find Than, no matter if he was alive or dead. The villagers saw the family heading toward the temple and joined them. When they reached the site, they saw a figure hunched over, lying on the ground. Tears welled up in Mr. Munt's eyes as he realized it was Than. But why was he sitting there motionless? It took Mr. Munt a long moment to muster the courage to approach his son. When he finally reached him, he threw his arms around Than's body and wept. The villagers, recognizing Thane, the child the temple had gifted to Mr. Munt and Mrs. Hua, were moved to tears. Mrs. Hua and Leo, unable to stand on their own, were supported by other women as they made their way closer to Than. Just then, the sorcerer Nut Tien appeared out of nowhere. He looked at Mr. Munt and said, "Do not grieve. Your son has passed the test. From now on, the villagers will no longer need to live in fear. Take him home and give him this pill. He will wake up in a few hours." After saying that, the sorcerer vanished, leaving everyone in awe. But there was little time for astonishment. Everyone's priority was getting Than back safely. Mr. Munt, with the help of the villagers, brought Than back home, where Mrs. Hua and Leo tended to him with care. By noon, Than woke up. A few days later, he regained his strength and recounted the events of the night. He then asked the villagers to go to Fuho's house and redistribute the gold and silver that had been wrongfully taken from them over the years. The villagers rebuilt the temple, and soon after, Than and Leo were married, in a ceremony arranged by Mr. Munt, Mrs. Hua, and the entire village. With the evil spirits defeated, Than returned to a normal life, living peacefully with his family. As for why the sorcerer Nut Tien didn't defeat the evil spirits himself, and instead let Than do it, it was because of an old debt from a previous life. In this world, nothing happens by chance. Everything has its roots, and Than's life was just one part of that cycle of cause and effect. Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to this story. If you find it interesting, please click like or leave comments so we can perfect the next versions in the best way. Please subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications from us as soon as possible. Goodbye and see you again.